Well, thank you all for coming today. I really appreciate it. My name is Joe Ozier, and I'm a dog behavior trainer by trade. I train dogs and their people to connect, and dogs that have issues regarding jumping or biting or running off or digging, kind of like what you're going to see in the movie or the story. But so anyway, I have an audience participation test, and I'd like everybody to participate. So I'd like you to make the following sounds.
Ooh. Make it sound like a siren.
Make that siren sound. Perfect. Now, woof. Woof. There you go. Okay. All right, so you may applaud now for yourselves. Thank you. Well done. Okay, so this is a story of a runaway dog named Shea. And it's called Shea's Lounge, written by Joe W. Ozier. That would be me. Shea the runaway was a dog that lived for 2 years on the streets. Every day of her life was a struggle to survive. She learned that eating food out of trash cans could keep her alive, but it also brought her lots of unwanted attention. Everyone she came across was always yelling and throwing things at her. She thought that this was the way dogs were supposed to live because it was the only life she knew. She never knew what it meant to have a real home. She lived and slept on the cold and sometimes mean streets of the town. She was always on the run and moving from place to place. She never slept in the same spot 2 nights in a row. The nights were cold and the people she met were mostly unfriendly. She believed that this was how her life would always be. One of her favorite places to beg for food and water was the local fire station. The firemen were always happy to give Shea food because they could see that she was very hungry and that she looked helpless and alone. "This poor girl is homeless," said one fireman. "She has a very kind face, but nobody has taken care of her. Just look at how skinny and dirty she is. This poor dog needs my help." So, on that particular day, the kind-hearted fireman gave her a ride in the fire truck all the way to the closest city.
Sound like the fire truck.
The fire truck stopped at the Humane Society, and Shea was taken inside and given a bath. It was the first bath of her life, so she struggled and tried to get away, but when she realized that the people scrubbing her weren't hurting her and that she was smelling a whole lot better, well, she started to enjoy it. Joe was a nice middle-aged man who lived alone. He worked all day at the library, and when he came home, he enjoyed watching television to help him unwind. After a long week, he was settling in for a quiet weekend when a commercial came on TV advertising that the local shelter had lots of great pets to adopt. They mentioned how owning a pet can help prevent loneliness and add years to a person's life, not to mention adding years to the pet's life as well. Well, Joe thought to himself, "I want to live longer, and perhaps I am a bit lonely. Why not at least go down to the shelter and look around? I don't have to adopt a pet if I don't want to. I'll just go and browse around." So, bright and early Saturday morning, Joe drove his car to the shelter and began looking at all the dogs. There were so many different types and sizes of dogs to choose from, but none really jumped out at him as the perfect companion. Joe figured it was meant to be, and so he began to walk towards the exit. Just as Joe was about to leave the shelter, he heard a rather distinctive bark. It was more like a woof than an actual bark. He looked over his shoulders in the direction of that woof, and there, sitting in a cage all by herself, was Shea. He looked over to her cage and looked into her eyes. "You have a good-looking face, and you seem nice enough, and you're about the right size," Joe said. He then asked Shea, "Are you a good dog?" Shea woofed and wagged her big bushy tail at Joe. Joe's heart skipped a beat. Joe knelt down right in front of Shea to get a better look at her. Joe smiled at Shea. Shea smiled back at Joe. Joe decided that Shea was a perfect dog for him. He couldn't believe how happy she made him feel. Shea looked like she felt the same way about Joe. So, Joe adopted Shea. Shea got her shots, her dog tag, and her microchip. Joe got a list of how to safely prepare his home for his new arrival. Joe then bought a big bag of healthy dog food from the pet store and drove Shea home. Joe took a bowl out of his cupboard and painted the name Shea on it in big bold letters. Joe filled that bowl with dog food and set it on his porch right in front of her. Shea couldn't believe that Joe had given her food just like that. Well, she quickly ate every tasty kibble in that bowl. Joe and Shea both realized that they were happier than they had been in years. Joe watched with pride as Shea wandered around his backyard, sniffing everything in her path. After a few minutes, Joe went back inside his home to make the necessary preparations for his new family member. Shea kept exploring her new yard, and after a few minutes, she noticed a hole in the fence. Her survival instincts always told her to never stop and to always keep moving. So she squeezed through that hole and was gone in a flash. A few minutes later, Joe came back outside to check on his dog, but Shea was nowhere to be found. He looked everywhere for her, but no Shea. All he found was Shea's empty dog bowl. Joe got in his car and drove around the neighborhood, calling out her name, but he could not find her. His heart sank at the thought of losing his new best friend. He wondered if he would ever see her again. After hours of driving the neighborhood, Joe came back home feeling very sad and worried about losing his new dog. As he entered his home, his phone was ringing, and to his surprise and joy, it was an officer from the Humane Society. He told Joe that he had caught Shea running in an alley. Joe said Shea must have escaped through a hole in his fence. The man told Joe he could come and get Shea anytime after Joe fixed all the holes in his fence. He also told Joe that some dogs who have lived on the streets for a very long time tend to go back to that life because it's the only life they know. He said that some wild dogs can't live the simple life in a home and that perhaps Shea can never be tamed. Joe went out into his backyard and walked all along his fence line until he discovered where Shea had escaped. He felt so guilty. He blamed himself for not preparing his yard properly for his new guest. For the next few hours, Joe did what he could do to fix the fence and all the holes in his fence. He checked and rechecked all the places along his fence where Shea might escape, because he loved Shea, and he couldn't bear the thought of her wandering somewhere out in the big world again, all alone without him. Joe felt his yard was finally ready, so he drove back to the Humane Society and picked up his dog. Joe was so happy. Shea looked happy too. Joe brought Shea home again, and the two of them walked all around the yard. Shea didn't seem like she was looking to find another way to get out. After they had their walk, they both sat together in Joe's backyard, enjoying each other's company. Joe sat on his backyard lounge chair, petting Shea the rest of the day. Joe seemed very confident now that Shea could not get through his fence, so the next morning he went back to work without any worries. Shea found herself alone again in the yard. Once again, Shea's survival instinct told her to keep moving and to run away. Within a few minutes, Shea found a bit of soft dirt under a part of the fence. With the determination of a trapped animal, Shea dug and dug until she was free. She squeezed under the fence and ran away without a care in the world. When Joe came home from work, he couldn't wait to see his new best friend. He went straight to the backyard and called for her, but she didn't come. Joe walked around his yard to find Shea, but what he found instead was a hole under his fence. He immediately called the Humane Society, and they told him that she wasn't there. They reminded Joe about what he needed to do to make sure Shea couldn't get out. He told them that he had fixed all the holes in his fence, but that she had dug under the fence. Well, they were disappointed and saddened by his loss. They told him that perhaps he was incapable of taking care of a runaway dog like Shea. After running for hours, Shea stopped under a tree to rest. She thought that it felt good to be back in the wild, living on her own again and being the master of her own destiny. Then suddenly a strange feeling came over her. She began thinking about what had happened to her over the last few days. She thought about the man who gave her his home and who fed her, and how she had enjoyed sitting next to him as he pet her. Then she remembered sleeping in the alleys filled with trash, and of the garbage cans that would be providing all of her future meals. Her survival instinct told her what to do next. She started to run, putting all of her canine senses into high gear. She began to see landmarks and familiar streets and smelled familiar things, so she began to run even faster. Finally, she came upon a neighborhood that looked right. It took her a few moments to get her bearings, but she found that familiar fence and slipped back through the same hole that she had escaped from.
Look at that.
When she was finally safely inside the yard, she jumped onto the lounge chair and waited for that nice man who had sat there once before, petting her all day. She never felt happier in all of her life. Her instinct now told her that she could stop running because she had found her forever home and her place in life on Shea's lounge. The end. So, anybody have any questions? Comments? Want to leave, hurry?
That was so nice.
So,
is Shea, did you find Shea in Fresno or was
no, I found Shea in Florida.
Oh.
I had moved to Florida and I was living there for 10 years. I moved there in 98 and in 2000.
But that's a real story.
It's a real story.
That was his
It's a
dog.
real true story. That's
That
right.
was him. He's the man.
And I was writing a musical about a dog I already had named Shep, and it was called Shep the Musical. And I wrote this over 10 years.
Oh.
And
Well, you
I
actually have
got
a
Shep in 1996, 2 years before I moved to Florida. And when I moved to Florida, Shep and I started doing community theater together, and I started training him to do shows with me. jumping through hoops and barking and taking bows to the audience and things like that.
But how Shea died?
Oh, she died of old age. She lived a nice long life. I had Shea for 10 years, and she was at least 2 when I got her. And so I'd gone to the shelter to go do some research because my story about Shep had to do with the shelter. And so I was doing some research in the shelter, and I came across Shea, kind of like in the story, and I figured she would be like a perfect companion for Shep, and she could be the love interest in the musical that I was writing about Shep. And so it turned out that Shea was available that day for adoption. That was her first day for adoption. She had been there 2 weeks, and so I had to bring my dog to the shelter and see if Shea and Shep could get along, and they got along just fine, and so I was able to adopt her and take her home, and then she started to escape every day or every other day, and she'd end up in a neighbor's house. I was told that she would be just running down the street. She saw an open front door and ran right into the people's home and jumped up on their couch and said, "Hey, hello, I'm Shea, how are you?" And they would, I had a tag on her and had my phone number, and so they'd call and say, "Your dog is in my home sitting on my couch. Come and get her now." Or the Humane Society called and say that we have your dog, we count her in the alley, and that part is part of the true part. And so she was a pill, and I had a month to return her. And honest and truly, I had about 3 days to decide if I was going to keep Shea or not, because my other dog Shep had kind of ignored her, and all she was about was, how do I get out of this place, And it kind of saddened me because I kept saying, why would you want to leave this? This is like, it's domesticity, but I take Shep out. I used to take him out on the kayak, and we did adventures all the time in the kayaking, the waterways of Florida, and rowing over to the Gulf Coast and swimming in the blue water, the turquoise water of the Gulf of Mexico. And I mean, it was like heaven. And so Shea, finally, after she had escaped the last time and I couldn't find her, looked all over the place, and I came home and she was sitting on that lounge chair. And I was like, oh my God. And she never left again. So I get choked up just thinking about it, because I could have let her go, but I didn't. And I kept her, and she became a great dog, and she ended up doing some other shows with me. I trained her to do a few things too, but mostly it was, just letting her live the life that a normal dog should live. And so that's it. Any other questions?
How did Shea die?
She died of old age. She was very frail, and she had a little accident, and the vet basically said that there's really nothing we can do other than put her to sleep in a nice, humane way, and so that's what we did. We had to put Shea to sleep, and it was very sad. And I was there with her, and I was holding her hand and petting her. Don't let me think about it, or it's going to get ugly here. But yes, Shea was a good dog.